Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. After waging one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history, many would say his finest, Napoleon was now to enjoy the fruits of his victory, summoning new republics into being, negotiating an end to the war with Austria, and nurturing his status as the most celebrated military commander in Europe. In May 1797, while waiting for the details of the peace treaty with Austria to be settled, Napoleon moved his headquarters to the huge Baroque palace of Mombello, near Milan, which had a sweeping vista of the plains of Lombardy. With its sumptuous drawing rooms and lofty colonnades, this palace now attracted more attention from Europe than all the courts of the emperors and kings, overthrowing dynasties and forging republics, while dukes, princes and kings sought his friendship and favour. Napoleon was deciding the destiny of Italy. A year earlier, an unknown Napoleon had taken command of a destitute army, and now he had become more powerful than the government of his own country. Yet, according to one of Napoleon's new friends, the poet Arnaud, Napoleon shows no haughtiness, but he has the poise of someone who knows his worth and feels himself in the right place. Despite the encroaching formality, this was a wonderful time to be an officer in Napoleon's circle. One of the remarkable things about this period, wrote one of his oldest friends, Marmont, was the admirable spirit and the ardent zeal of all those who surrounded him. Each one of us had the sense of a future without limits. There was grandeur, hope and gaiety. In those days, our ambition was altogether secondary. Our glory and our pleasures alone occupied us. A bold and cordial spirit reigned amongst us, and no circumstances, no events, seemed to carry the slightest threat. After the dangers and stresses of a year on campaign, Napoleon was enjoying a moment of calm. Marmont described him at this period with the air of a master in his attitude. In those happy far-off days, Bonaparte exhibited a charm that none could deny. The poet Arnaud remembered of when he first met Napoleon, surrounded by his military court. When Napoleon appeared, everyone stood up, waited on a glance, a word, the slightest sign from him. Gathering around Napoleon in a circle, he began to tell stories, talking about his victories and military affairs, then the next moment about philosophy and poetry. To the interest of these remarks, uttered now in a serious voice and now with animation, must be added the authority that is given by a remarkably expressive face, the severe expression of which is often softened by the kindliest smile, by a look which reflects the deepest thoughts of the most powerful intelligence and the warmest feelings of a most passionate heart. To all this must be added the charm of a melodious and manly voice, and then it will be possible to conceive how easily Bonaparte won by his conversation those whom he desired to fascinate. After talking steadily for 2 hours, Napoleon then left, and Arnaud turned to a friend and said, "That man is an exceptional being. Everything succumbs to his superior genius, to the force of his character. Everything about him bears the stamp of authority. You notice how his authority is recognized by people who submit to him without knowing it, or perhaps in spite of themselves. What an expression of respect and admiration the men wear who approach him. He is born to command, as so many others to obey. If he is not lucky enough to be carried off by a bullet before 4 years from now, he will be in exile or on the throne." As Napoleon himself said to one French diplomat, "Here, I am more of a sovereign than commander of an army. I have tasted command, and I cannot give it up." While Napoleon remained simple in his personal tastes, he already understood the effects of courtly display and splendour, and dazzled the Milanese, who crowded in front of the palace gates, waiting for hours to catch a glimpse of him. According to some, he was a Brutus. According to others, he was soon to be a Caesar. When opposed to royalism, he made use of men with the strong ideas of his generals, like Augereau. But when he needed to cajole the nobles of the Ancien Regime, Josephine, with her charming manners, was elicited. She helped Napoleon play his double role of a revolutionary leader and a conservative. The spring of 1797 was perhaps one of the happiest periods in Napoleon and Josephine's lives, as she herself often said. It all must have seemed like a bewildering dream to them both. A few years earlier, Josephine had been imprisoned during the Terror, awaiting the guillotine. Hardly a year had passed since Napoleon, a penniless officer, was cooped up in a garret in Paris, not knowing where to get a franc for his next meal. But now the name of Bonaparte was emblazoned throughout Europe. By day, Josephine could be seen strolling gracefully in the gardens. By night, she hosted an endless round of pleasures and amusements, balls and dinners, luncheons and hunts, and was almost treated like royalty. In the words of her confidante, Madame de Remusat, love seemed to come every day to place at her feet a new conquest over a people entranced with its conqueror. One admiring visitor noted that Josephine had an angelic face, dazzling skin and a ravishing voice, dark blue eyes, always half closed under heavy lids, fringed by the longest eyelashes in the world, an unusually perfect body, and a suppleness, an incredible lightness in all her movements, both aerial and majestic. Lord Permont, an old family friend of Napoleon's, back when he had been a teenage cadet in Paris, was less impressed with her, writing that she was an astonishing woman and must formerly have been very pretty, though no longer in the first bloom of youth. Neither was the poet, Carrion de Nissas, at all enamoured with her. Madame Bonaparte is neither young nor pretty, but she is extremely modest and engaging. She frequently caresses her husband, and he seems devoted to her. Often she weeps several times a day, for very trivial reasons. Today, we might be cynical about such an easy resort to tears, but Josephine was a product of an emotional era, at a time when weeping was not just an expression of sadness, but a social skill. The 18th century cult of sensibility demanded that men and women cry when they were happy, when they were sad, when they were in love, and when they were out of love. While even in the theatre, a play was judged a failure if it did not elicit tears. And for women, tears were part of their mystery, the emotionality that was feminine. Napoleon himself acknowledged that nothing embellished a woman better than rouge and tears, and he could not resist them. A man who is unmoved by tears has no heart. Like most of his generation, brought up on tear-stained novels, Napoleon was touched by them, and so Josephine and her perpetual weeping represented to him the quintessential woman. However, the Directory were already suspicious of Napoleon, and filled his new court with spies. So Napoleon rarely entrusted any plans, which he wanted to be kept secret, to Josephine, who could not easily conceal her thoughts. A secret, he once observed, is burdensome to Josephine. Someone who could have extracted a secret from Napoleon, who could make his expression as immovable as marble, would have been a shrewd man. Josephine later claimed, "I never beheld Napoleon for a moment perfectly at ease, not even with myself. He is constantly on the alert. If at any time he appears to show a little confidence, it is merely a feint, to throw the other person with whom he speaks off his guard, and to draw forth his sentiments. But never does he himself disclose his real thoughts." At this time, Fortune, Josephine's ill-tempered pug, finally met his match when the cook's dog, a large surly mongrel, grew tired of the pug's daily attacks and one day fatally turned on him. To console Josephine, her lover Hippolyte Charles secretly gave her a replacement. Not long afterwards, Napoleon spotted the cook sulking in their garden and asked him what was the matter. The cook replied, "General, after what my dog did, well, I was afraid that you would hate the sight of me. Your dog? Don't you have him anymore?" "Excuse me, General, he never sets a paw in the garden, especially since Madame has another." "Bring him back," Napoleon retorted. "Perhaps he will rid me of this one too." Napoleon might have been winning battles and forging and destroying states, but he could not put a dog out of the room. Any suspicion Napoleon might have still felt about his wife had been quickly forgotten by her charming company. Once, when Josephine was defending women from some remarks he made about their frivolity and insincerity, he replied, "Oh, my dear Josephine, they are all nothing compared with you." At first, Josephine had insisted that her poor health demanded she return to Paris, but now she announced that she would, after all, stay at Mombello, a decision she might have taken, because Hippolyte's duties required him to stay there for the whole summer, which was a bittersweet one for Josephine's illicit affair. Promoted to the rank of captain, Hippolyte was now part of Napoleon's wider entourage, so Josephine saw him daily, but there was no opportunity to resume the affair. Among the French officers, extramarital flings were so rampant that the Milanese ladies sniffed that Josephine was insufferably vain, that Napoleon had eyes only for her. Indeed, Napoleon's morality was widely noticed. Speaking of his many talents, one observer compared him to Solomon. "Oh no," another exclaimed, "what do you mean by calling him wiser than Solomon? The Jewish king had 700 wives and 300 concubines, while Napoleon is content with one wife, and she older than himself." Of his self-restraint, Napoleon explained, "Truly, I have something else to think of than love. No man wins triumphs in that way without forfeiting some palms of glory. I have traced out my plan, and the finest eyes in the world, and there are some very fine eyes here, shall not make me deviate a hair's breadth from it." Napoleon was able to enjoy another of the fruits of victory, being reunited with his family. After all the dangers they had run in Corsica, then their poverty in the south of France, and the risks he had faced on the battlefields of Italy, now they were safely reunited, and Napoleon took pleasure in lavishing the good things of life on all of them. Neither did he forget his stepchildren in Paris, sending Eugène a gold watch, and Hortense many presents. However, she was still sceptical of what to make of Napoleon as her new father. Even though her head mistress at her Paris boarding school, Madame Campo, had become almost hysterically enthusiastic about him, as news of his victories flooded into the newspapers. "Do you realize that your mother has united her fate to that of a most remarkable man? What gifts, what valor, fresh conquests at every moment." "Madame," Hortense coolly replied, "I will give him credit for all his other conquests, but I will never forgive him for having conquered my mother." When Madame Campo finally convinced Hortense to write a letter to Napoleon, her tone was churlish, and she wrote of his marriage to her mother, "What surprises me is that you, whom I have so often heard speak badly of women, should have made up your mind to marry one." Napoleon's reply was kind, but unfortunately his handwriting was so bad that it was not until years later that Hortense was able to get it fully deciphered. But by then he had long since won her over. Napoleon also thought of another woman, his ex-fiancée Désirée Clary, who was at that time in Rome with Joseph and her sister. Possibly still feeling guilty for breaking off their engagement, Napoleon began looking for a good husband for her. As a suitor, Napoleon sent her General Dufault, writing that he was a distinguished officer, a man of the highest character. A marriage with him would be most advantageous. All went well, and the two became engaged. But it all came to nothing, as Dufault was tragically stabbed in a revolt in Rome. At the family gathering, Napoleon's mother Letizia was the last to arrive. On the first day of June, Napoleon rode out to meet her at the gates of Milan, where crowds cheered the mother of the liberator of Italy. As Napoleon folded her in his arms, Letizia whispered, "Today I am the happiest mother in the world." For Napoleon, too, that moment was one he would always treasure. Louis was there too, at this stage Napoleon's favourite brother, who had acted as one of his aides-de-camp, having been one of the first French soldiers to cross the River Po. But at 19, Louis's character was changing. He began to lose his taste for soldiering, his cheerfulness and his willingness to please. His health became a constant worry, and he was never happier than consulting doctors about the vague pains that plagued him. Becoming shuttered, introverted, enigmatic, he often forsook the circle at Mombello and went for long solitary walks. Losing touch with his comrades, he cultivated relationships with unknown young writers, earnestly and possessively. 17-year-old Pauline, whose beauty was described as near perfection, was still her madcap self, and she would always be Napoleon's favourite sister. According to the poet Arnaud, she was the prettiest and the worst-behaved person imaginable, chattering away without pause, contradicting the most eminent personages, sticking her tongue out at her sister-in-law behind her back, nudging my knee when I wasn't paying her enough attention, and drawing upon herself from time to time the most terrifying looks of reproof from her brother, which used to crush the most obdurate of men. The next minute she would begin again, and the authority of the commander of the army of Italy succumbed before the giddiness of a young girl. Still, she was a good child by nature, rather than by effort, for she had no principles, and was capable of doing good merely from whim. Napoleon now forbade Pauline to marry her first love, Stanislas Ferron, a dissipated politician who was 26 years older than her, and was now being accused of serious atrocities back at the siege of Toulon, responsible for having had hundreds of innocent people guillotined. Instead, Napoleon gave his consent for Pauline to marry General Leclerc, who had been in love with her for years, ever since he had fought at Napoleon's side back at Toulon. 25 years old, Leclerc was fair-haired, handsome, popular, and heir to a well-off flour merchant. Leclerc admired Napoleon so much that he had started copying his grave mannerisms and even wearing a simple grey overcoat just like his, all of which earned him the nickname of the Blonde Bonaparte, which he took as a compliment. According to rumour, the match came about because one day, while Napoleon was working in his cabinet at Milan, he heard a noise, got up, and discovered Pauline and Leclerc behind a screen in a compromising situation. Their wedding was arranged without delay. The same day, Napoleon also saw to it that the church blessed the marriage of his clever and capable eldest sister, Elisa, who had a few weeks earlier married Felix Bacciochi, a dull but decent Corsican. Amid these celebrations, Napoleon's own marriage with Josephine was subjected to the scrutiny of the Bonaparte family. It did not win their approval. Admittedly, almost any woman Napoleon had chosen would have been in for a rough ride. He was the breadwinner and the head of the entire family, and anyone else who had influence over him would be watched like a hawk, especially a woman as extravagant as Josephine. Josephine intimidated the Bonapartes. She was an elegant Parisienne, a woman of fashion, something of a celebrity. The sober islanders disliked this fast, frivolous ex-vicomtesse, and were outraged by her countless new dresses, designed with a maximum of panache and a minimal of material, and their propriety was shaken by the lively Parisian friends she had brought to Italy to ease her boredom. Even if they could have overlooked this, in light of Josephine's kindness and gentle manner, one thing they could not overlook was the presence of Hippolyte Charles, exchanging glances and smiles with her. Napoleon's 3 sisters in particular could not outgrow their wariness when faced with Josephine's effortless sophistication. Their jealousy soon turned into active dislike, especially Pauline, who caused Josephine the most distress. The 2 women actually had a lot in common. Both lived for fashion and frivolity, and Pauline's decadent reputation would in time far outstrip Josephine's. But Pauline detested her sister-in-law and did not see her as a friend, but a rival. She, who adored Napoleon, hated to see him so under Josephine's thrall. She made faces behind Josephine's back, called her a worn-out glove, and insisted on referring to her as La Vieille, the old woman. For the time being, Joseph did not look too disapprovingly on Josephine. Knowing how passionately his brother loved her, he saw no use in openly siding with the rest of the family against her, for which he was richly rewarded. Napoleon had Joseph made French ambassador to Rome with an income of 60,000 francs a year. But the pivotal figure in the Bonaparte family was the formidable Letizia. Her resistance to her son's wife was, she claimed, not personal. Josephine was simply too old, older than her son, a widow with 2 almost fully grown children, and she showed no signs of bearing Napoleon a child. But more than that, Josephine was everything that Letizia loathed, a decadent aristocrat, indolent and fickle, of dubious moral standards and excessive spending, whereas Letizia was steeped in solid Corsican values, modesty, chastity, and an almost obsessive frugality. Letizia remained impervious to Josephine's charm that others found so beguiling, and could never bring herself to like her wayward daughter-in-law. The Bonaparte clan was insular and instinctively hostile to outsiders. As Corsicans, they were no strangers to hereditary hatred. They resented the spell Josephine had cast over Napoleon, who seemed blind to her faults. They closed ranks against her, in a feud that would last for the rest of her life. Napoleon was certainly saddened that his family did not take to Josephine, but they soon went their own ways. Letizia only stayed for a fortnight before returning to live in the Casa Bonaparte in Ajaccio, which, having been ransacked by Paolis when they had fled the island, Napoleon was now having specially repaired and refurnished for her. Hippolyte Charles was also seen around less often. For a time, he had to rejoin his regiment. That summer, Napoleon and Josephine were left to spend time together, and enjoyed a belated honeymoon. Josephine wanted to visit the lakes of Como and Maggiore, and one sunny day, she and Napoleon, with a glittering retinue, set off along the vine-clad hills to the lakes. Berthier and Mio de Melito were sat with them in their carriage, and described Napoleon as elated, animated, told us several anecdotes from his youth. But at one point, the 2 men sat frozen with embarrassment when opposite them in the carriage. As Melito delicately put it, Bonaparte was extremely attentive to his wife, frequently taking marital liberties with her, but his free manners were marked with such a lively feeling of affection and tenderness for that woman, as likeable as she was good, that we could easily forgive them. After seeing Lake Como, they were all driven across to Lake Maggiore, setting sail on a boat with silk banners, with the rowers beating time to the music. They landed on the so-called beautiful island in the middle of the lakes, with its quaint arcades, hanging gardens, and Napoleon's favourite spot, the solitary palace where they spent the night. On one of the marble terraces, Napoleon noticed a large orange tree brimming with fruit, which Josephine had taken shade under with a few friends. Just as they were admiring the scenery, Napoleon slipped up behind the tree without them noticing, and with a sudden shake, brought down a shower of fruit on them. Her friends screamed and ran off, but Josephine stayed put. "Why, Josephine," he dryly observed, "you stand fire like one of my veterans. And should it be otherwise? Am I not the wife of their commander?" Josephine may not yet have fallen in love with her protective, demonstrative, adoring husband, but Napoleon had enough love for the both of them. The most lasting fruit of Napoleon's victory was his reorganisation of Italy. In driving out the Austrians, Napoleon had accomplished only one aspect of his task. The other lay in bringing to Italy the benefits of the French Republic. He wanted to create a new Italian political culture based on the French Revolution that would prize meritocracy, nationhood, and free thinking. Napoleon put more of his interest and imagination into state building than into any military campaign or diplomacy. In this sense, he differed from Alexander the Great, who spent nearly all of his 13-year reign as King of Macedonia in conquest, and from Caesar, who spent most of his 14 years in military campaigns and provincial governing. Out of them, only Napoleon is remembered for his political thought. Only he consciously put so much of his creativity and will into state building. And first, he began in Italy. After freeing an Italian town from the Austrians, Napoleon would plant a tree in the town square, a tree of liberty, whose green leaves symbolized man's natural rights. At first, Napoleon had allowed the traditional form of government to carry on, but changed certain hostile pro-Austrian local officials. The reforms that Napoleon imposed on the regions he conquered included abolishing feudal privileges and tithes, and ending noble assemblies and other centres of privilege. He abolished internal tariffs, which helped to stimulate economic development, and began financial restructurings aimed at bringing down state debt. He ended the archaic and restrictive guild system for merchants and artisans. And by circulating his two army newspapers, both Republican, he encouraged the Italians to set up newspapers of their own in a land which had never known freedom of the press. Napoleon's attitude to the church was to stamp out injustice and superstition. He imposed religious tolerance. In the papal city of Ancona, for example, Napoleon had discovered with dismay that Jews were forced to wear a yellow hat and the Star of David, and to live in a ghetto that was locked at night. Muslims from Albania and Greece were also treated as second-class citizens. Napoleon immediately ended both of these humiliating injustices, closing the ghettos and allowing them to live anywhere. Napoleon also abolished the Inquisition, and sometimes confiscated and nationalized church property and land, while also encouraging priests to keep out of politics and to behave according to the gospel principles of Jesus' charity, self-sacrifice, and forgiveness. Superstition he found less easy to define. The people of Ancona possessed a sacred statue of the Madonna, which was reported to be shedding tears at the French invasion. Napoleon had the statue brought to his headquarters. He examined the eyes, which were said to open and close through a hidden mechanism, but he could find no trickery. He then ordered the Madonna to be safely returned to its sanctuary, but to be covered from view. There remained what to do with its jewel diadem and pearl necklaces, and Napoleon ordered these to be divided up between the local hospital and the poor. But later, perhaps due to his own superstitious tendencies, he changed his mind, which was rare for him, and had the jewellery returned to the statue. It was also among the Italians that Napoleon developed a more militaristic spirit. The Italians were seen as an effeminate people, unable to withstand the French or the Austrians in battle. When the Austrians saw that Napoleon was trying to make soldiers out of the Italians, they ridiculed the idea, saying that they had already tried that, and that it was impossible for an Italian to make a good soldier. Yet, in Lombardy, the Italian militia Napoleon had created immediately sprang to arms when a detachment of Austrians had made a sally from Mantua, taken it prisoner, and led it in triumph to Napoleon. He himself recalled, "I raised many thousands of Italians who fought with a bravery equal to that of the French, and who did not desert me, even in adversity." In Milan, in the schools, streets, drawing rooms, children's games, and public opinion, there was a transformation. At the theatre, the Italian was no longer portrayed as beaten by the German matador. It was the Italian who beat and drove away the German. Stirring marches replaced religious chants and amorous serenades. Mantua had been the birthplace of the great Roman poet Virgil, but neither the Italians nor Austria had built a monument in honour of him. Hardly had the siege been over than Napoleon built a mausoleum and organised a grand festival in the poet's honour. Voltaire's view that European civilization was on a progressive course, was widely held in France at Napoleon's time, and underlay his modernizing mission. This was the Directory's political agenda too, although Napoleon increasingly imposed his views with less and less deference to theirs. But were the Italians even worth helping? The Directory called for the facts. The average Italian nobleman was rich and privileged. Only he could get the top jobs. He lived for masquerades and dances. He even had the right to enter anyone's house as soon as violins were heard. He gambled heavily, kept a mistress, turned a blind eye to his wife's flings. He had put up a pitiful resistance to the French. If he cared strongly about anything, it was not politics. Having grown indolent and disabused by the rule of foreigners or the Pope, he drifted through life, his one aim to far l'ora, kill time. Two main options were open to the directors. They could either export Republican government to northern Italy, or they could treat it as degenerate and therefore just a pawn to be cynically sacrificed at the peace table. Discouraged by their agency's pessimistic reports, the directors preferred the second option. Foreign Minister Delacroix thought that Italy did not deserve to be republicanized. General Clark reported that the Slavish Italians were not ripe for liberty, and many Italians agreed with him. The Lombard economist Pietro Vetri considered his own people too politically backwards to be worthy of the reign of virtue. But Napoleon took a different view. If the Italians had these weaknesses, it was because they had been enslaved for too long. Venice may have sunk into incorrigible decadence, with its swarm of nobles, its silly and cowardly population, as Napoleon put it. But elsewhere, Napoleon had found that the virtues that had flourished in the past were not dead, at least not among writers, lawyers and scholars, and could be encouraged to thrive once more. Indeed, Napoleon believed that they must be encouraged, as he saw that all of Europe was locked in a great ideological war. When Napoleon had entered Milan, the Lombard patriots had pressed him to overthrow their old regime and declare it a republic. And Napoleon had thought so too. Milan must become a republic, otherwise she would once again become France's enemy. In a series of letters, which reflected his 10 years of political reading and writings, Napoleon put forward his point of view on Italy to the Directory, because of his victories, because he had brought Austria to the peace table, and above all, because he was arguing for a positive course of action, not a negative one. Napoleon got his way. He was practically given free rein to set up his new republic. Napoleon decided to call it the name the ancient Romans had used, the Cisalpine Republic. Napoleon himself authored its constitution, modelled on France's. All men were to have equal rights, and like France, the government was to be led by 5 directors, who Napoleon appointed first, as well as the first members of the councils. Later ones would be chosen by public vote. On the 29th of June, the free and independent Cisalpine Republic came into being, albeit it was now a French protectorate. Napoleon proclaimed to the Milanese, "You can, you must be free, but without undergoing the misfortune that the French people knew, in order to consolidate liberty, and with the sole aim of your happiness. I have carried out a task that hitherto had been undertaken from ambition or love of power. We have given you liberty. Take care to preserve it, to be worthy of your destiny. Make only discreet and honourable laws, and execute them with energy. Favour the spread of knowledge, and respect religion. Compose your battalions, not with disreputable men, but with citizens, imbued with the principles of the Republic, and closely linked with its prosperity. You have need to impress yourselves with the feelings of your strength, and with the dignity which befits the free man. Divided and bowed by ages of tyranny, you could not have won your own freedom alone. Left to yourselves for a few years, there will be no power on earth strong enough to take it from you." To the north of Milan, there was a small state called the Valtellina, just 18 miles wide and 50 miles long, containing 160,000 people. They had become subject to a Germanic state, called the Grisons, who had deprived them of all political power. Catching the spirit of liberty, the people of the Valtellina revolted and released a manifesto to Europe, setting out their grievances. Both states sent envoys to Napoleon, asking him to intercede. To promote reconciliation, Napoleon proposed that the Valtellina should remain with the Grisons as one people, but that in return, the Grisons should give them equal political rights. But when the Grisons refused this, Napoleon issued a decree. It is not just that one people should be subject to another people. Since the Grisons have refused equal rights to the people of the Valtellina, the latter are at liberty to unite themselves with the Cisalpine Republic. Napoleon's republic proved such a success that the ex-papal states, led by Bologna, petitioned him to join it, and with the directors' consent, these states were joined to Milan in July 1797, doubling the republic's size and population. But now, Genoa's aristocratic government found itself isolated between Republican France and the Cisalpine Republic. The Genoese Popular Party rose up, and the aristocracy fell on any French who happened to be in the territory. So Napoleon decided to intervene. The old system began to topple, and Napoleon must have felt extremely pleased when the people pushed it over. By doing so, they ended a regime which had oppressed Corsica for 300 years. Napoleon applauded when the Genoese burned their Libro d'Oro, a stud book containing a list of all those whose blood was noble enough to rule. In mid-1797, Napoleon set up Genoa as the second of the Italian states he founded, called the Ligurian Republic. The Genoese aristocracy were forced to abdicate, and the Popular Party took over government. But then, the Genoese democracy began to trample on the rights of their former oppressors. The tumultuous revolutionary scenes, which had once taken place in Paris, were being reenacted. The priests and the nobles were excluded from government, while Catholic priests were insulted and lawless violence went unpunished. In promoting republicanism, Napoleon insisted on its positive and constructive elements, and tried to stop the extremism that sometimes came with the new institutions. Napoleon declared to the Genoese, "Citizens, I learn with the greatest displeasure that the statue of Andrea Doria has been pulled down in a moment of passion. Andrea Doria was a great sailor and statesman. Aristocracy was the liberty of his time. The whole of Europe envies your city's precious honour of having given birth to this famous man. I do not doubt that you will make haste to restore his statue. Please put down my name as a contributor towards the expense." But again, at the end of the year, Napoleon had to reprove the Genoese, urging them to be more moderate. "I will respond, citizens, to the confidence you have placed in me. It is not enough that you are free from hostility to religion. You should also do nothing which can cause inquietude to tender consciences. To exclude nobles from any public office would be a shocking piece of injustice. You would be repeating the wrong that they themselves did in the past. Why are you people of Genoa so changed? Your first impulses of fraternal kindness have been succeeded by terror and fear. Remember that the priests were the first who rallied around the tree of liberty. They first told you that the morality of the gospel is democratic. Men have taken advantage of the faults, perhaps of the crimes of individual priests, to unite against Christianity. You have denounced without discernment. Whenever the people of any state, particularly a small state, becomes used to condemning without hearing, and to applaud speeches merely because they are passionate, when exaggeration and fury are called virtue, moderation and equity named as crimes, the ruin of that state is at hand. Believe me, I shall consider that one of the happiest moments of my life, when I hear that the people of Genoa are united amongst themselves and live happily." Napoleon's advice to them was also intended to have a reaction back in France, where the Directory was then considering a law to banish all ex-nobles from the Republic. In founding his two new Italian republics, Napoleon had not originated the concept of a sister republic, but he experimented with it in Italy beyond what anyone else had done. As a result, Italians saw the emergence of the Giacobini, who were imbued with the principles of the French Revolution. Napoleon gave them the chance to exercise limited political power, but the actual sway of the Giacobini never went much beyond the cities, and so for now, much of the old order remained. Still, Napoleon had brought genuine enlightenment to peoples who, without his army's victories, would have often remained without rights or equality. Napoleon's modernizing measures, which were to be repeated in most territories that he conquered over the coming decade, were applauded by middle-class progressives in many lands, including by those who hated the French and Napoleon. What is more, apart from briefly in the previous summer in Lombardy, and later in rural southern, ultra-Catholic Calabria, there would be no mass revolts against Napoleonic rule in Italy, in the way that there later would be in the Tyrol and in Spain. Overall, the Italians accepted that French methods of government were better off for them than the Austrian ones had been. By exporting the French style of patriotism to the Italians, he made them aware of their own wider national identity. For the first time in centuries, the northern Italian states were united, and later Napoleon would take this even further. He himself had chosen the Cisalpine Republic's flag, the same as the French tricolour, but instead with a green stripe, Napoleon's favourite colour. This was the same flag that was to be used to rally the eventual Risorgimento movement, when all the Italian states were unified into one nation in 1861. It has been kept as the Italian flag to this day. In July 1797, Talleyrand, one of the most fascinating figures of this time period, became France's new foreign minister, the first of his 4 terms in the post. Highly intelligent, subtle, witty, well-travelled, lazy, pleasure-seeking, and club-footed with a limp since childhood, Talleyrand could trace his noble ancestry back to the 9th century counts. As far as he had any guiding principles, he had a professed affection for the English constitution, though he would never have endangered his own career or comforts to promote that or anything else. Famous for his scorching sarcasm and wit, Talleyrand once said that speech was given to man to conceal his thoughts, and on his profession, diplomacy, a diplomat who says yes means maybe, a diplomat who says maybe means no, and a diplomat who says no is no diplomat. As the prestigious Bishop of Autun, before he was excommunicated in 1791, Talleyrand had contributed to the Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man, but had then been forced into exile, which he spent in England and the United States. The first thing Talleyrand did on becoming foreign minister was to ingratiate himself with the young conqueror of Italy. He wrote to Napoleon, asking for his friendship. "The mere name of Bonaparte is an aid which ought to smooth away all my difficulties." Napoleon sent him an equally effusive reply. Alexander triumphed, perhaps only to enthuse the Athenians. Other captains are the elite of society. You, for example. I've studied the revolution too much not to know what it owes to you. The sacrifices which you have made for it deserve recompense. You would not have to wait for it were I in power. Amid their mutual flattery was already the promise of what might come from a political alliance. Napoleon was to write to Talleyrand often and confidentially, and in one letter that September, "It seems to me that Italy is very poorly seen and very poorly known. As for me, I have always taken care to make things happen according to the interests of the Republic. If one does not believe me, I do not know what to do. All great events hang always only by a hair. The skillful man takes advantage of everything and neglects nothing that can give him a few more chances. The less skillful man, sometimes by neglecting a single one, loses everything." For many years, Napoleon would hold a seemingly unbounded admiration for Talleyrand, calling him the king of European conversation. Towards the end of his life, however, Napoleon had seen through him completely. He rarely gives advice, but can make others talk. I never knew anyone so entirely indifferent to right and wrong. Talleyrand's only loyalty was to himself. As he put it, "Regimes may fall and fail, but I do not." In due course, Talleyrand would betray Napoleon, like he did everyone else, and Napoleon took it very personally. The likelihood that a man like Talleyrand would die peacefully in his bed was proof for Napoleon that there can be no God who metes out punishment. Meanwhile, in September 1797, yet another political explosion was about to erupt in Paris. Another attempt by the Royalists to destroy the Republic and seize power. Although Napoleon's victories were applauded by the French public, none of his popularity had rubbed off on the directors, and the elections of that year had just seen a massive pro-royalist backlash. Moreover, 2 of the 5 directors actually favoured the return of a king to rule France, the Bourbon heir, the Comte de Provence. The survival of the Republic hung by a thread, which the Royalists hoped to cut. To do this, they gained the support of the famous General Pichegru, a household name as the Conqueror of Holland, who brought a large number of Royalists to Paris and secretly armed them. Now, Napoleon discovered some papers on a Royalist agent, which proved that Royalist deputies were about to put a coup into motion, with the support of the Bourbon princes and English money. These papers were sent to Paris, and by them it was proven that General Pichegru was a traitor. Napoleon immediately decided to lend his support to defending the Republic, and so he sent the avidly Jacobin General Augereau to Paris. When he arrived, the directors asked him why he had come, and Augereau innocently replied, "Me? Why, I've come to kill Royalists." The directors took him at his word and gave him free rein in trying to thwart the plot. After investigating, Augereau decided he needed money to deal with the various factions, and he wrote to Napoleon asking for some. When sending the funds, Napoleon said, with some understatement, "That fellow Augereau is rather warm." Napoleon then reassured the Directory, "If you need forces, summon the armies." Napoleon now thought the time fitting for a grand Republican festival, and decided that on the 14th of July 1797, the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, he would throw a great military parade in Milan. The celebration was intended as a strong demonstration against royalism, and to make an impression in Paris before their threatened coup. On the sides of a high pyramid, emblems of liberty and the French Republic were engraved, with the names of the men who had fallen on the battlefield since Montenotte. The troops formed a square around the pyramid, while they saluted the veterans and the wounded who marched by. Then Napoleon himself reviewed them, and when he reached the carabiniers of one of the regiments, he declared, "Brave carabiniers, I'm glad to see you. You alone are worth 3,000 men." In front of the 13th Regiment, he declared, "Brave soldiers, you see before you the names of your comrades murdered before your eyes at Verona, but their spirits must be satisfied. The tyrants have perished with their tyranny." The officers of each regiment then went forward to receive their flags from Napoleon. "Citizens, may these banners always be in the path of liberty and victory." While the army was marching by, a corporal of the 9th Regiment approached Napoleon and said, with tears running down his cheeks, "General, you have saved France. Your men, proud to belong to an invincible army, will make a rampart of their bodies. Save the Republic. Let the 100,000 men who make up this army crowd together in defense of liberty." That evening, Napoleon hosted a dinner to the officers and veterans, and proposed his toast to the spirits of the brave Stongal, who fell on the field of Mondovi, of La Harpe, who died on the field of Fombio, of Dubois, who died at Roveredo, and to all the brave men who died in defense of liberty. May their spirits always be near us. They will warn us of the ambushes set by the enemies of our country. Mountains separate us from the soil of our homeland. You will cross them as swiftly as eagles, to preserve the Constitution, to defend liberty, and to protect the government and the Republicans. Since France's other top general, Hoche, had also committed himself to defending the Republic, the Directory now felt strong enough to confront the threatened royalist coup. It was not a moment too soon. Indeed, on that very same day, Vaublanc, one of the most influential royalist tribunes, had decided to denounce the 3 Republican directors, and they decided to head him off. Soldiers led by Augereau occupied the council chambers in the Tuileries and Palais Bourbon, and arrested the main royalist leaders, including the 2 pro-royalist directors. The disgraced General Pichegru was then convicted and deported to Guiana, from where, a few years later, he would escape to London. There, Pichegru would join forces with the Bourbon prince, the Comte d'Artois, who was to entrust him with the mission of assassinating Napoleon, despite Pichegru having been his mathematics teacher during his school days at Brienne. The day after the coup, Napoleon received a letter from Talleyrand. Paris is calm. Augereau's conduct was exemplary. It is clear that he has been taught in the right school. Now, the directors were once again indebted to Napoleon, without who the French Republic probably would not have survived this coup. Meanwhile, peace talks with Austria were still ongoing. Napoleon knew that the final and most important battle of the Italian campaign was going to be won over a peace table, and Napoleon, now in a new role as diplomat, was forced to defend his newborn Italian republics in the arena of international relations. Napoleon wanted the peace treaty signed, sealed and delivered as quickly as possible, but he was in for a shock. The Austrian emperor's envoys moved as slowly at the peace table as the Austrian generals had on the battlefield. The Austrian negotiator, Gallo, insisted on being referred to in all documents as his long-winded stream of titles, a formality which wasted much ink and time. That summer, the peace talks were moved to Campo Formio in the Veneto, where Napoleon faced a new Austrian diplomat. Cobenzl was a plump professional, up to every trick of the game. Hoping for a French setback, or help from their ally England, Cobenzl did everything he could to delay the treaty. Once, he objected to a document from the Directory because, according to their sober Republican style, it was written on paper, not the finest parchment, and its seals were not big enough. 2 precious days were lost because of this. Napoleon would always call Cobenzl the White Bear of the North, as although he was amiable in society, he was abruptly German in these diplomatic meetings, and was always replying to any proposal, "It cannot be, my master will never consent to it." The Austrians were rapidly recruiting to rebuild their army, and kept throwing difficulties in the way of reaching a final agreement. Now, diplomacy was war by other means. As the delays piled up, and all of his victories seemed about to be nullified, Napoleon became increasingly restless, biting his nails and losing his patience. It would appear difficult to understand the stupidity and bad faith of the court of Vienna, he told Talleyrand, and called the negotiations just a joke. Once, Cobenzl, referring to the Rhine frontier, announced with a false air of regret that he had no power to act on behalf of the states of the German Empire. To this, Napoleon made the devastating retort, "The German Empire is an old cook, accustomed to being raped by all and sundry." Napoleon tried to make up for his erratic behaviour by deploying the social skills of his wife, who Cobenzl described as amiability personified. Josephine hosted dinner parties and organised amusements for the Austrian diplomats. Cobenzl gained the impression that Napoleon was somewhat in awe of his wife. He described how one night, at a dinner with both French and Austrian diplomats, Napoleon began to mischievously bombard Josephine with little pieces of bread, but at one reproachful look from her, Napoleon hung his head and stopped. For all her gracious behaviour, Josephine was not happy during these weeks. She heard a rumour that Hippolyte Charles was having an affair with an Italian woman. She also missed Paris and Paul Barras more than ever, writing to him, "I can hardly wait to tell you of my affection for you. Write to Bonaparte to sign the treaty, and then I will soon be with my friends again. I love you with all my heart. Bonaparte sends you warmest greetings. He still adores me." During these discussions at Campo Formio, millions were once again offered to Napoleon in bribes. The Venetians offered Napoleon a colossal gift of 1.5 million francs, which he declined. The Emperor of Austria expressed his deep admiration for him and made him the alluring offer of naming him ruler of a kingdom of 250,000 subjects, which he could pass on to any heirs. Napoleon sent his thanks to the emperor, but asserted that he could only accept honours which were bestowed on him by the French people, and that he would always be satisfied with whatever they offered him. When someone alluded to the stark contrast of this with the corruption of the directors, Napoleon replied, "You are not then aware, citizen, that there is not one of those directors whom I could not bring for 4,000 francs to kiss my boot." During the last meeting, the 4 Austrian negotiators, including Cabenzel, were sat on one side of a table, Napoleon by himself on the other side. The Austrians demanded terms which Napoleon could not accept, and threatened that if he did not agree to them, Russia's armies would join Austria's, and France would be forced to accept even less favourable terms. One of the Austrian diplomats concluded with the words, "Austria desires peace, and she will severely condemn the negotiator who sacrifices the interest and repose of his country to military ambition." Napoleon had been listening in silence. Then, rising from the table, he took from the sideboard a beautiful set of antique china. "Gentlemen," Napoleon announced, "the truce is broken, war is declared. But remember, in 3 months, I will demolish your monarchy as I now shatter this porcelain." With these words, Napoleon dashed the china to the floor. Bowing to the astonished Austrians, he abruptly left the room. Napoleon's negotiating technique often involved such theatrics, usually put on for show. However, another version of this story goes that Napoleon knocked the china over accidentally when angrily waving his arm. Whatever was broken, Cabenzel remained calm, merely reporting back to Vienna, "He behaved like a fool." Next, Napoleon immediately sent an offer to Archduke Charles, telling him that hostilities would resume in 24 hours, and sped off in his carriage towards his army's headquarters. The Austrian envoys were thunderstruck by this ultimatum, and the next day they agreed to Napoleon's terms, which were highly advantageous to France. The Directory, keen to strengthen itself against the monarchical powers of Europe by revolutionizing the whole of Italy and founding republican governments there, positively forbade Napoleon to make peace with Austria unless she recognized the independence of the Republic of Venice. But Napoleon replied to the Directory that, if they insisted on that, securing peace with Austria would be impossible. The Directory argued, "Austria has long desired to swallow up Italy, and to gain maritime power. It is the interest of France to prevent both of these designs. It is evident that if the Emperor gains Venice, with its territorial possessions, he will secure an entrance into the whole of Lombardy. We would be treating as if we had been conquered. What would history say of us if we surrender that great city with its naval depots to the Emperor? The whole question comes to this: shall we give up Italy to the Austrians? The French government neither can nor will do so. It would prefer all the hazards of war." Although Napoleon too wanted to secure republican liberty in Venice, even if it was doubtful whether most Venetians wanted liberty, he was willing to give up that desire to secure the peace, which also meant disobeying his government's orders. Mid-October had now arrived. One morning at daybreak, Napoleon was told that the mountains were covered in snow. Leaping from his bed and rushing over to the window, he saw it for himself. What? Before the middle of October? What a country is this? Well, we must make peace. Napoleon then shut himself up in his cabinet for an hour and carefully reviewed his army statistics. "I cannot have more than 60,000 men in the field. Even if victorious, I would lose 20,000 in killed and wounded. And how, with 40,000, can I withstand the whole force of the Austrian Empire, who will rush to the relief of Vienna? The armies of the Rhine could not march to my aid before the middle of November, and before that time arrives, the Alps will be impassable from snow. It is all over. I will sign the peace. The government and the lawyers may say what they choose." The next day, 17th of October, France and Austria, worn out by this war of principle, as Napoleon called it, at last compromised, and 1 year, 7 months after he had first taken command, Napoleon signed the peace treaty of Campo Formio. This treaty extended French territory all the way to the Rhine, and the Austrian Netherlands, roughly modern-day Belgium, was formally handed over to France. In compensation for this, Napoleon allowed the Emperor of Austria to extend his sway over the Venetian Republic, which is divided between France and Austria. The French part of Venice joins its other Italian client states to form an even larger Cisalpine Republic. And so Lombardy, Modena, Bergamo, Cremona, Ferrara, Bologna, and the Romagna were all united. They would be France's allies and a shield against her enemies. Most crucially, Austria agreed to recognize this new republic, as well as Napoleon's other Ligurian republic, as legitimate states. Napoleon also insisted that the famous figurehead of the French Revolution, General Lafayette, who was then the Austrians' prisoner in the dungeons of Olmütz, must be released, and even scored a last-minute advantage. Napoleon managed to keep the Ionian Islands for France, and so gained a foothold in the eastern Mediterranean, which would soon prove very useful. As he said goodbye to Cobenzl, Napoleon felt elated enough to apologize for his earlier brashness. "I'm a soldier, used to risking my life every day. I'm in all the fire of my youth, and I cannot show the restraint of a trained diplomat." By the Treaty of Campo Formio, Napoleon not only made a favourable peace, but he also secured Austria's recognition of the two Italian republics he had founded, which would be the most worthwhile acts of his Italian campaign. The newfound peace was warmly welcomed in Paris, where Napoleon's prestige rose to even greater heights. Talleyrand wrote him a fulsome letter. "Now there is peace, peace à la Bonaparte. The Directory is pleased, the public overjoyed. The Italians may squeal a bit, but that is of no consequence. Farewell, General and Peacemaker. My regards, admiration, respect, thanks, words fail me. The list could go on forever." Napoleon had begun his command with only a tattered, half-starved army. He left it with a famous name, a good reputation, and as a benefactor and liberator to the Italians. He had discovered within himself new talents, as a military leader, politician, even as a diplomat. In October, Napoleon was free to leave the scene of his triumph, but not before one last speech to his army. "Soldiers, I set out tomorrow for Germany. Separated from the army, I shall mourn for the moment of my rejoining it, and braving fresh dangers. Whatever post the government may assign to the soldiers of the army of Italy, they will always be the worthy supporters of liberty, and of the glory of the French name. Soldiers, when you talk of the princes you have conquered, of the nations you have set free, and the battles you have fought in 2 campaigns, say, in the next 2, we shall do even more.